Imagine you are sitting in the most powerful room on Earth. The curtains are drawn. The phones are swept for listening devices. On one side of the table sits the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, a prince of the royal family, the brother of the most powerful man in the Middle East. On the other side, senior officials of the United States government. This is not a diplomatic meeting. There are no cameras, no press releases, no formal communiques. What is said in this room is never supposed to leave it. But what was said in that room changed everything. It triggered a war. It sealed the fate of a supreme leader. It ignited a firestorm across 9 countries simultaneously. And it set in motion a chain of economic and geopolitical events that the entire world is still reeling from as you watch this video right now. What you are about to hear is the full and complete story of how a secret meeting between Saudi Arabia and the United States lit the fuse that exploded the Middle East, and why the shockwaves from that explosion are coming directly for your wallet, your savings, your retirement account, and your future. Before we go any further, stay with us through the end of this video, because in the final section, we are going to reveal the single most critical factor that will determine whether this conflict ends in weeks or drags on into something far, far worse. The answer will surprise you, and it has almost nothing to do with Iran. To understand how we arrived at this extraordinary moment in history, you have to go back several months before the first missile was ever fired. You have to understand a diplomatic chess game that was playing out simultaneously on 2 completely separate boards, with 2 completely different sets of rules, and with 2 completely different definitions of what victory would look like. On one board, the United States and Iran were engaged in the most sensitive nuclear negotiations since the Obama administration. Shuttle diplomacy mediated by the government of Oman, secret back channels running through multiple intermediaries, whispered promises of sanctions relief in exchange for verified nuclear concessions. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was telling the world on social media that a historic agreement was, in his words, within reach. He was urging diplomacy. He was projecting optimism. He was calling for patience. As recently as February 25th, 2026, just 3 days before the bombs fell, Iranian negotiators were sitting in Geneva, Switzerland, and talking about the architecture of a deal that could have prevented everything that followed. On February 6th, Iran and the United States had begun the first round of indirect nuclear negotiations in Geneva, mediated by Oman's foreign minister. The talks were structured carefully. The American and Iranian delegations never actually sat in the same room. Omani mediators relayed positions between the 2 rooms, a format that preserved Iranian insistence on sovereign dignity while still allowing the 2 sides to communicate. Vice President J.D. Vance complained publicly about this arrangement, telling a podcast that negotiating with a country when you cannot even talk to the person in charge was bizarre and made diplomacy very, very difficult. He was referring to Supreme Leader Khamenei's deliberate absence from the process, his refusal to authorize direct contact. Secretary of State Rubio said after one early round that he was not sure you could reach a deal with these guys. The language of American officials, even in the moments when they were supposedly pursuing diplomacy, was the language of men who had already made a different decision. A second round followed on February 17th. A third round was held on February 22nd, with Oman describing a positive push, but acknowledging significant differences remained. On February 26th, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi told the world that peace was within reach, that Iran had agreed during the talks never to stockpile enriched uranium, and that this represented a major breakthrough. A 4th meeting was being scheduled for the following week. By every outward measure, diplomacy was alive and moving. But on the second board, a very different game had been playing out for months, and the pieces on that board had been moving since long before anyone sat down in Geneva. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had been conducting a series of extraordinary phone calls directly to Donald Trump. According to 4 people familiar with the matter, as confirmed by the Washington Post, the Saudi Crown Prince was lobbying Trump repeatedly and persistently, not to pursue peace, not to give diplomacy more time, but to attack. He was telling the American president that Iran would become something far more dangerous if left unchecked. He was making the case that the window for decisive military action was closing fast, that the longer Washington waited, the more Iran enriched, the more its missile arsenal grew, the more its proxy networks embedded themselves across the region. MBS was not speaking in diplomatic abstractions. He was speaking with the urgency of a man who believed he was living next door to a powder keg, and that the only way to survive was to detonate it before it detonated him. To appreciate the full weight of the Saudi position, you have to understand something about the history of Saudi Arabia and Iran that goes back not just years, but decades. These 2 nations have been engaged in one of the most consequential proxy rivalries in the modern world, a competition for influence that has played out in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Bahrain, and in every corner of the Arab and Muslim world where power was available to be contested. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the 2 holiest sites in Islam. Iran is the world's most powerful Shia majority nation, led by clerics who explicitly believe it is their divine mission to export the Islamic revolution across the Muslim world. These two visions of Islamic authority and regional leadership are not reconcilable. They never have been. And for 47 years, since Khomeini's revolution in 1979, they have been at war. Not a war of armies facing each other across a front line, but a war of proxies, of oil prices, of influence operations, of assassination, of information campaigns, and of narrative. Mohammed bin Salman has been the most aggressive Saudi leader in a generation in prosecuting that rivalry. He launched a military intervention in Yemen specifically to roll back Iranian influence there. He engineered a blockade of Qatar, in part because of Qatar's relationships with Tehran. He has spent billions building alliances, purchasing American weapons systems, and positioning Saudi Arabia as the indispensable partner of American military power in the Middle East. The Abraham Accords of 2020 had begun to normalize relationships between Israel and several Arab states, creating a new regional alignment that Iran watched with growing alarm. Saudi Arabia had been approaching its own normalization with Israel, a development that Tehran understood as the final consolidation of an anti-Iranian alliance that would permanently marginalize the Islamic Republic's regional influence. From Iran's perspective, the diplomatic trajectory of the region was existentially threatening. From Saudi Arabia's perspective, the nuclear trajectory of Iran was existentially threatening. Both sides were right about the threat they faced. Both sides were miscalculating the cost of the confrontation they were engineering. MBS was not alone in pressing Washington. The Israeli government was simultaneously pushing the same message, sharing target data, providing military intelligence officials who flew to Washington specifically to make the case for strikes on Iranian leadership targets. Israeli officials had signaled clearly that if the United States would not act, Israel was prepared to act unilaterally, as it had done during the June 2025 strikes. An unusual alliance had formed. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel, two nations without formal diplomatic relations, united in a private lobbying campaign to push the most powerful military in human history into a war that both of them wanted, but neither of them could fight alone against a nation of 90 million people sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves. And yet, publicly, the story looked completely different. Saudi Arabia maintained its official position that it supported a peaceful diplomatic resolution. It told Iran directly, and this is confirmed in multiple accounts, that the kingdom would not permit its airspace or territory to be used for any attack on Iran. Mohammed bin Salman personally told Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian that Saudi Arabia would not allow its skies to be used as a corridor for strikes. Qatar, the UAE, Turkey, they all made similar statements. The entire Gulf was publicly insisting it wanted peace, while privately something else entirely was being whispered in Washington corridors. Qatar said publicly it would not permit its territory or airspace to be used for an attack. The UAE said the same. Turkey said it opposed American military action and offered to mediate negotiations. Arab Gulf diplomats were in contact with both Tehran and Washington, urging caution and warning that conflict could cause a severe spike in oil prices. On the surface, it appeared that the entire region was united behind a diplomatic solution. This is the defining contradiction at the heart of the secret meeting that changed history. In a closed-door briefing in Washington, away from cameras, away from official statements, away from anything that would ever appear in a State Department press release, Saudi Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman, brother of Crown Prince Mohammed, delivered a stark and unambiguous private message to American officials. The Saudi Defense Minister said that if Donald Trump did not follow through on his threats to strike Iran, it would only embolden the regime. He was not asking for patience. He was not asking for more diplomacy. He was telling the Americans that inaction was itself a strategic catastrophe. He was saying that a United States that threatened but did not act would produce an Iran that was more dangerous, more aggressive, and more emboldened than any strike could ever create. In private briefings with think tank experts and Jewish organization representatives in Washington, Prince Khalid delivered the same message with the same clarity. The Saudis wanted this war. They needed it to happen, and they were willing to say so, just not where anyone could record them saying it. Think carefully about what that means. The same kingdom that was telling Iran it would never allow its airspace to be used for strikes was simultaneously telling Washington in private that not striking Iran was the single most dangerous thing America could do. This was not a contradiction born of weakness or confusion. This was a deliberate, sophisticated, and ruthless diplomatic strategy. Saudi Arabia needed to be able to tell Tehran, after the bombs fell, that it had not participated, that it had not enabled, that its hands were clean, while simultaneously ensuring that the outcome it wanted actually happened. It was playing both sides of the board with complete strategic clarity, and it was doing so with the full and sober understanding that the stakes could not possibly be higher. The Washington Post confirmed that Trump's ultimate decision to attack Iran came after this weeks-long lobbying effort by both Israel and Saudi Arabia. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the American negotiators who had led the diplomacy, told Trump it would be difficult, if not impossible, to reach a deal with Iran. Witkoff later accused Iran of trying to strong-arm the American team. He said Iranian insistence on the right to enrichment had made any agreement impossible. Even within the administration, the hawks had won the argument long before the diplomats finished talking. When Witkoff and Kushner told Trump the talks had failed, the authorization that had been waiting was signed. The machinery of war, which had been running quietly in the background for weeks, was finally activated. And so, on February 28, 2026, just 48 hours after the final round of Geneva talks concluded without a breakthrough, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The scale of what happened next was almost incomprehensible. American and Israeli forces struck Iranian military installations, missile sites, nuclear-related infrastructure, and command centers in a coordinated campaign of extraordinary breadth and precision. The operation targeted not just Iran's weapons programs, but its entire leadership structure. In a statement on Truth Social, Trump said Iran posed a threat to core national security interests of the United States, that the regime was continuing to expand its nuclear and ballistic missile program, and that the United States would not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. He said the military action would annihilate the Iranian Navy, destroy Iran's missile sites and program, and weaken the network of Iran-backed terrorist and armed groups across the region. From the White House, he declared that the United States had begun a major combat operation in Iran aimed at eliminating threats from the Iranian regime, and added that this regime would soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States armed forces. Within hours of the strikes, there were reports that Mohammad Pakpour, commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Iran's defense minister Amir Nasirzadeh had been killed. And then came the report that shook the entire world. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran with absolute authority for more than 3 decades, the final word on every decision made by the Islamic Republic since 1989, had been killed in the strikes. Donald Trump relayed to NBC News that a large amount of leadership in Iran had been killed. The Iranian government that had been sitting at a negotiating table in Switzerland just 2 days earlier was gone. The international community's reaction was immediate and divided almost perfectly along the lines of the new global order that has been forming for years. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said Europe was supportive of the American position and that Iran was a threat. Australia, Canada, Germany, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, New Zealand, and more than a dozen other nations, either explicitly or implicitly, supported the strikes. Ukraine's President Zelensky, reflecting his country's dependence on American goodwill, called for a regime change in Iran, saying he would support action against Iran's regime, not against its people. But China condemned the killing of Khamenei as a violation of the United Nations Charter. Russia described the attack as an unprovoked act of armed aggression. Brazil, Norway, Spain, Pakistan, and Malaysia all expressed opposition. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the strikes were squandering an opportunity for diplomacy and condemned both the American-Israeli action and Iran's counterstrikes. China and Russia requested an emergency Security Council session under the agenda item of threats to international peace and security, citing what they called an unprovoked and reckless act of military aggression by the United States and Israel against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran itself sent a letter to the Security Council asserting its right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter and requesting an emergency meeting to address what it called the unlawful use of force. The world had split, and it had split precisely along the fault lines that analysts had been predicting for years. The American-led order on one side, the emerging Russia-China-Iran axis on the other, with a vast middle ground of nations trying to hedge, survive, and avoid being forced to choose. Iran's response was immediate, and it was nothing like anything that had come before. In every previous confrontation, after the killing of General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, after the June 2025 Israeli strikes, Iran's retaliation had been measured, strategic, calibrated almost to the millimeter. One base struck. A signal sent, escalation avoided, but this time was fundamentally different. The killing of the supreme leader himself was not a proportional provocation. It was an existential one. And Iran's response was designed to communicate something that no measured strike could ever communicate. That if the Islamic Republic was going to burn, it was going to take the entire region with it. Iran launched hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones, not just at Israel, not just at American military bases, but at 9 separate countries across the entire region simultaneously. Saudi Arabia was struck, Qatar was struck, Kuwait was struck. Bahrain, Jordan, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, and Cyprus, the British military base at Akrotiri and Dhekelia, all struck in the same coordinated campaign. The IRGC declared that all Israeli and U.S. military targets in the Middle East had been hit by the powerful blows of Iranian missiles. and that the operation would continue relentlessly until the enemy was decisively defeated. This was not a retaliation. This was a declaration that every nation hosting American forces was now a legitimate target, regardless of what the nation had said publicly about staying neutral. In Doha, Qatar, where the United States maintains Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East, journalists on the ground reported hearing more than a dozen explosions in a matter of hours. Most of them were the sound of American Patriot defense batteries intercepting incoming Iranian ballistic missiles overhead. The largest American base in the entire Middle East, home to thousands of U.S. military personnel, home to the aircraft being used to strike Iran, was being targeted by Iranian missiles, while those missiles were being shot down in the sky above a city of 2 million people. The war was no longer theoretical. It was happening in the sky above people's heads in real time, over a city that had spent the previous 20 years building itself into a global hub of finance, aviation, and diplomacy. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iranian proxy that had largely stayed quiet since its significant degradation in the conflicts of 2023 through 2025, joined the war on March 2nd, launching a missile attack on Israel following the confirmation of Khamenei's death. Israel responded immediately with new airstrikes in Lebanon, reopening a front that the ceasefire agreement of 2024 was supposed to have closed. In northern Iran, Kurdish armed groups simultaneously launched a ground offensive in northwest Iran. United States officials reportedly reached out to Iraqi Kurdish forces requesting cooperation with cross-border operations. The war was spreading in every direction at once, and the question of where it would stop had no visible answer. The Saudi Foreign Ministry confirmed that Iran had targeted Riyadh and the kingdom's eastern region. The attacks were repelled, but the ministry issued a statement of cold fury, noting with precise diplomatic language that the attacks came despite Iranian authorities knowing that Saudi Arabia had confirmed it would not allow its airspace and territory to be used against Iran. The kingdom that had privately pushed for war was now publicly furious about being caught in the resulting firestorm. It condemned the attacks in the strongest terms and warned of dire consequences. It also noted that the events had started with Israel and the U.S. attacking Iran. It was simultaneously condemning Iran for retaliating, acknowledging that the American-Israeli attack had started the sequence of events, and disclaiming any responsibility for the outcome, all in the same statement. The joint condemnation issued by the United States, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE denounced what they called Iran's indiscriminate and reckless missile and drone attacks against sovereign territories. These are not the words of neutral bystanders. These are the words of nations that have been attacked on their own soil and are deciding what comes next. The immediate economic fallout for the Gulf states themselves has been severe and deeply ironic. Dubai, the city that rebuilt itself as the crossroads of global commerce, the financial hub connecting east and west, the tourism destination that drew 40 million visitors a year, the logistics center through which goods flowed from Asia to Europe and back, found its international airport disrupted, its shipping lanes threatened, and its carefully constructed image of stability shattered by the very conflict its leaders had quietly encouraged. The UAE relies on trade and services for the overwhelming majority of its non-oil economic activity. Its model depends entirely on peace, on connectivity, on being the one place in a turbulent region where business can be done without interruption. Iran's strikes on UAE territory did not just damage physical infrastructure, they damaged the psychological infrastructure of the entire Dubai model, the perception of safety and reliability that every multinational corporation, every financial institution, and every global logistics company had built its Gulf operations around. Maritime insurance premiums for the Persian Gulf rose by 50% almost immediately after the strikes, with major providers issuing cancellation notices effective March 5th. The Gulf Cooperation Council states rely on oil and gas exports for between 30 and 90% of government revenue. The delay in export commercialization created by the Strait closure is disrupting the flow of funds necessary for government budgets and sovereign wealth fund operations at exactly the moment those governments need resources to respond to attacks on their own territory. But Iran was not finished. What it did next in the Strait of Hormuz will define the global economy for years to come. The Strait of Hormuz is, without question, the most strategically critical 21 miles of water on the surface of the earth. It sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea beyond. Every single day, before this crisis began, approximately 20 million barrels of oil passed through this channel, representing roughly 1/5 of all the petroleum liquids consumed by the entire human civilization on any given day. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil. 20% of every barrel of oil burned by every car, every factory, every power plant, every cargo ship, every commercial aircraft on the entire planet, all of it moving through 21 miles of water. The strait is also the exit route for approximately 20% of all global liquefied natural gas trade, primarily from Qatar's massive North Field, the single largest natural gas deposit on Earth. Beyond crude and natural gas, 30% of Europe's jet fuel supply originates from or transits through the strait. 16% of global gasoline and naphtha flows past through it. In a single action, Iran had positioned itself to threaten not just the Middle East's oil, but Europe's aviation fuel, Asia's manufacturing energy, and the entire global supply chain infrastructure that connects the Gulf to the rest of the world. Within hours of Operation Epic Fury, Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders were broadcasting warnings on VHF radio, the same radio channels that commercial shipping uses for navigation, to every vessel in the strait. No ship was allowed to pass. Any vessel that attempted transit would be targeted. On March 2nd, a senior IRGC commander confirmed officially that the strait was closed and warned that any ship attempting passage would be set ablaze. At least 5 tankers were damaged in Iranian attacks. Shipping data from marine traffic showed over 150 tankers, including crude oil carriers and liquefied natural gas vessels, dropped anchor in open Gulf waters beyond the strait, clustered off the coasts of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, unable to move and waiting to see what happened next. On March 5th, major protection and indemnity insurance clubs, the mutual insurers that cover the vast majority of the world's commercial shipping, canceled war risk coverage for any vessel attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Without insurance, no commercial operator could legally or financially justify the risk. MSC and CMA CGM, the largest container shipping companies on Earth, all pulled their vessels out of the corridor entirely. The Houthi movement in Yemen, seizing the moment, simultaneously announced it was resuming attacks on Israel and commercial ships in the Red Sea, meaning that the alternate route around the Arabian Peninsula, through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, was simultaneously threatened. Ships rerouting through the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, face an additional 2 to 3 weeks of transit time and supply chain costs that multiply every price in the global economy. The numbers coming out of energy markets since this crisis began should concern every American who has a car, a utility bill, a retirement account, or a grocery budget. Brent crude oil, which was trading near $72 per barrel in late February, surged immediately after the strikes and has already climbed above $84 per barrel. Energy analysts at firms, including Rapidan Energy Group, Kepler, and the Stimson Center, are warning that a sustained closure of the strait could push prices toward $100 per barrel or higher. The energy consultancy Kepler has estimated that even with alternative pipeline routes, the Saudi East-West pipeline and the Abu Dhabi to Fujairah pipeline, a serious Hormuz disruption could remove between 8 million and 10 million barrels per day from world supply. You cannot route your way around that reality. There is no alternative infrastructure capable of substituting for those volumes on any near-term timeline. What happens to oil prices does not stay in the oil market. It travels through the global economy the way a shockwave travels through solid stone. Invisibly, silently, but with devastating and compounding force. When oil rises by 20, 30, or 40%, it raises the cost of manufacturing everything, because nearly everything manufactured on Earth uses petroleum in some part of its production chain. It raises the cost of shipping everything, because every cargo ship, every truck, every freight airplane burns fuel. It raises the cost of food, because modern agriculture runs on fertilizers derived from natural gas, and because transporting food from farm to grocery store costs money at every step. It raises inflation across the entire consumer price index. And when inflation rises in an environment where central banks are already cautious about cutting interest rates, it tightens financial conditions. Mortgages become more expensive, credit becomes more expensive, corporate borrowing costs rise, business investment slows, and the kind of steady economic expansion that keeps people employed and retirement accounts growing begins to stall. The economic contagion from the Strait of Hormuz closure does not respect the distinction between oil importing and oil exporting countries. Even nations that produce their own oil face higher inflation because oil is priced globally. Even nations far from the Persian Gulf face higher shipping costs because the rerouting of global cargo around the Cape of Good Hope adds weeks to every supply chain and multiplies freight costs dramatically. The insurance crisis in the Persian Gulf has sent ripple effects through maritime insurance markets globally, raising premiums in waters that have nothing to do with Iran or the Middle East. The financial market volatility generated by the uncertainty of the conflict has tightened credit conditions globally, raising the cost of capital for businesses and households in countries that have no direct connection to the Strait of Hormuz. This is the hidden mechanism of modern economic interdependence. A war in 21 miles of water translates within days into higher mortgage costs in Ohio, higher grocery bills in Georgia, and lower retirement account balances in Florida. Natural gas markets in Europe have already reflected the scale of this panic. Before this crisis, European natural gas was trading around 30 euros per megawatt hour. Within days of the strait closure, prices spiked above 60 euros per megawatt hour, nearly double, before settling back slightly. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar, and that Qatari LNG moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar, which hosts the American military base being targeted by Iranian missiles, is simultaneously the country that heats European homes and powers European industry with natural gas that can no longer leave the Gulf. The International Crisis Group's Iran director said directly that closure of the Strait of Hormuz would disrupt roughly a fifth of globally traded oil overnight, and that prices would not just spike, but gap violently upward on fear alone. The shock, in his assessment, would reverberate far beyond energy markets, tightening financial conditions, fueling inflation, and pushing fragile economies closer to recession in a matter of weeks. The pain is not evenly distributed. The countries most exposed to this crisis are in Asia. China, India, Japan, and South Korea together accounted for 69% of all crude oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz before this crisis began. Japan depends on imported fossil fuels for 87% of its total energy use, and 95% of its crude oil imports come from the Middle East. Japan moves 1.6 million barrels per day through the strait. A sustained closure does not just raise Japan's energy costs, it widens its trade deficit, weakens the yen, and pushes the Japanese economy towards stagflation of the most damaging kind. South Korea moves approximately 1.7 million barrels per day through Hormuz, representing 68% of its crude imports. Seoul has announced emergency contingency planning and is drawing on strategic petroleum reserves. India relies on the strait for 50% of its crude imports and is watching its import bill explode in real time, with currency pressure building across emerging Asian markets simultaneously. And China, the second largest economy on Earth, the world's largest crude oil importer, the factory floor of global civilization, has approximately 50% of its oil imports passing through this corridor. Beijing has sent a diplomatic envoy to the region and has condemned the killing of Khamenei. But China is not merely a passive observer. Its entire economic model, its manufacturing sector, its power grid, its industrial output, its social stability, its political legitimacy, depends on affordable, reliable energy flows through a waterway it cannot physically control. Kepler data shows China's LNG inventories at the end of February provided some short-term cover, but a sustained closure forces China into the spot market competing for Atlantic cargoes, tightening the entire global LNG basin and raising prices for everyone simultaneously. OPEC Plus has pledged to increase output by approximately 206,000 barrels per day to mitigate the shortfall, a gesture that addresses approximately 1% of the problem. There's another dimension to the economic impact of this crisis that deserves specific attention: the relationship between the Strait of Hormuz closure and the United States dollar itself. The petrodollar system, the arrangement informal but deeply embedded in global financial architecture, by which Gulf oil is priced and traded in US dollars, has been one of the primary mechanisms sustaining American financial power for the past 5 decades. When Gulf states sell oil, they receive dollars. When they invest those dollar revenues, they often invest in American Treasury securities, funding US government debt at favorable rates. When the strait closes and Gulf oil cannot move, the dollar revenues stop flowing. The sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, funds that collectively manage trillions of dollars, much of it parked in dollar-denominated assets, face sudden disruption of their income streams precisely when they need resources to respond to Iranian attacks on their own infrastructure. This pressure does not immediately collapse the dollar. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and that status is not changed by any single crisis. But every crisis that strains the petrodollar system, every moment that demonstrates the vulnerability of Gulf oil revenue to military disruption, advances the case being made by Russia, China, and the BRICS coalition for reducing global dependence on the dollar and energy trade. The geopolitical war being fought in the Persian Gulf is simultaneously a financial war being fought over the long-term architecture of the global monetary system. And the outcome of that financial war has implications for the purchasing power of every American who holds dollars, owns bonds, or depends on American economic strength for their financial security. For investors and savers watching this unfold and trying to understand what it means for their portfolios and retirement accounts, the signals from the market deserve careful attention. Gold has historically functioned as the world's oldest and most reliable store of value in times of genuine geopolitical and financial stress. In the weeks leading up to Operation Epic Fury, gold prices were already rising, driven by what market analysts describe as war risk premiums. As the conflict escalated, those premiums accelerated. The physical gold market and the paper gold market are both reflecting the same fundamental reality. When 1/5 of the world's oil supply is disrupted, when global inflation expectations rise, when financial conditions tighten and growth projections fall, capital searches for safety. It searches for assets that preserve purchasing power in precisely the kind of inflationary, high uncertainty environment that a sustained Hormuz closure creates. Silver follows the same dynamic but amplifies it. Because silver serves dual roles as both a monetary safe haven and an industrial metal whose demand is linked to the green energy transition. Solar panels, electric vehicles, energy storage systems. That is simultaneously being driven by the same oil price shock that makes conventional energy more expensive. When oil goes up, the economic case for every technology that uses silver accelerates. The silver market has historically moved faster and further than gold in moments of genuine crisis. The conditions of this moment are exactly the kind of conditions in which that historical pattern reasserts itself most forcefully. For American investors watching their fixed income holdings, their equity portfolios, and their purchasing power navigate this environment, the assets that protect value in an inflationary, high uncertainty, supply-disrupted global economy are the same assets that have always performed that function across every major crisis of the past century. And now, layered on top of all of this economic disruption, comes the most dangerous political question of the entire crisis. Who rules Iran? When Supreme Leader Khamenei was killed, Iran lost not just a leader, but the entire theological and political architecture that had held the Islamic Republic together since 1979. The Supreme Leader is the Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardian jurist, a concept embedded in the Iranian constitution that gives religious authority supreme power over every branch of government, every military commander, every elected official. When that authority disappears, suddenly, violently, without preparation or succession planning, what fills the void is not a smooth constitutional transition. It is a power struggle between hardline clerics, IRGC commanders, reformist politicians, and tribal and ethnic groups who have been waiting decades for exactly this kind of vacuum. According to Iran International, the Assembly of Experts moved quickly. Reports indicate that Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the late Supreme Leader, has been selected as Iran's new leader. He has deep ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He has never governed, never publicly negotiated, never engaged with the international community as a visible political leader. Iran's top security official, Ali Larijani, announced an interim leadership council on March 1st, accusing the United States and Israel of trying to dismantle Iran and warning secessionist groups of severe consequences if they take action. The message was unmistakable. The IRGC and the hardline security apparatus intend to remain in control, and they intend to continue the fight. A new supreme leader with no public legitimacy and a base entirely within the IRGC's hardline faction has only one source of political authority: the claim that he is leading a successful resistance against American and Israeli aggression. If Iran stops fighting, that claim collapses, and with it, any hope of consolidating authority over a nation of 90 million people. This is the trap that major military interventions in the Middle East have consistently created. You remove the leader, you create a power vacuum, and the forces that fill the vacuum are often more extreme, more desperate, and more dangerous than what was there before. Iraq in 2003 taught the world this lesson. Libya in 2011 reinforced it. The question hanging over this conflict is whether Iran in 2026 becomes the third chapter in that story. He compared the situation to Venezuela. He dismissed Mojtaba Khamenei as a lightweight. Washington launched this war with multiple stated objectives that are in fundamental contradiction with each other: preventing nuclear weapons, destroying missile capabilities, weakening proxy networks, and achieving regime change by bringing the Iranian opposition to power simultaneously. These are not four complementary objectives. They are four different wars with four different timelines, four different required force structures, and four different definitions of success. The Chatham House think tank analyzed the thinking among Arab Gulf leaders and found that many had lobbied the United States against military action because they believed the greatest risks were an expansionist Israel and the chaos of a potential failed state in Iran. A failed state in Iran, one where the central government has collapsed but no viable replacement exists, would be catastrophically more dangerous than the Islamic Republic that existed before Operation Epic Fury. It would be an ungoverned territory the size of France, Germany, and Spain combined, sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, bordering Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Turkey, possessing residual nuclear technology and the institutional knowledge to rebuild it, and controlled by competing military factions with no unified command and every incentive for violence and chaos. The Chatham House assessment was that Arab Gulf leaders viewed this scenario as the greatest possible risk. Not a nuclear Iran, but a collapsed Iran in the hands of competing warlords and extremist factions hemorrhaging weapons across borders for a generation. Oman, the quiet mediator, the careful broker, the one Gulf state that Iran has not struck, played a central role in arranging the Geneva talks. Its foreign minister had expressed genuine optimism about a breakthrough just hours before the bombs fell. He is now calling on Washington, urgently and publicly, to not get sucked in further. Former CIA Director David Petraeus observed that Iran's decision to target not just Israeli and American assets, but also its Gulf Arab neighbors, was almost certainly a strategic error. By striking Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, the the UAE and Bahrain, nations that had tried to stay neutral. Iran pushed those nations firmly toward the American position. Russia and China have condemned the strikes but are not entering the war militarily. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said Europe is supportive of the American position. Australia, Canada, Germany, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and more than a dozen other nations have either explicitly or implicitly supported the U.S.-Israel strikes. The new global alignment is being drawn in fire. Now here is what everyone watching this video needs to understand about what comes next. And this is the revelation we promised you at the beginning. The single most important factor that will determine whether this conflict ends in weeks or spirals into something far, far worse is not military capability, not diplomatic creativity, not even the question of Iranian succession. It is economic pain. Specifically, it is the question of how long the United States government is willing to absorb the domestic economic consequences of a sustained Strait of Hormuz closure before it feels compelled to change course. Their assessment is precise. If Brent crude sustains above $90 per barrel for 1 to 2 weeks, it represents a meaningful headwind to the administration's domestic economic messaging, the same messaging that has been central to Trump's political brand since his first campaign. This is the same administration that made rapid tariff adjustments earlier in 2026 because of economic pain threshold concerns. The pattern is established. When domestic economic pressure reaches a certain level, policy recalibrates. The administration has two paths forward. The first is military. The United States Navy reopens the Strait of Hormuz through anti-mine operations, naval escort convoys, and suppression of Iranian anti-ship missile and drone capabilities. The American carrier strike groups already positioned in the region were specifically designed for exactly this kind of high-intensity maritime operation. If Washington commits to a full naval campaign to reopen the strait, it can probably achieve that objective within weeks. But every day the strait remains closed, costs the global economy approximately $2 billion in lost trade value. Every additional attack on Gulf infrastructure multiplies the economic disruption and extends the insurance paralysis that is the real mechanism of the closure. And every additional week of insurance withdrawal means another month of recovery time, even after a ceasefire, because underwriters do not return to dangerous waters overnight. The total economic cost of this closure, even if it ends within a month, will be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, distributed across every economy on Earth, felt most acutely by the most vulnerable people in the most import-dependent nations. The second path is diplomacy. Someone capable of talking to both sides must create an off-ramp fast enough to prevent the economic damage from becoming irreversible. Oman's credibility has been damaged by the collapse of the Geneva process it hosted, but China possesses something no other outside power has: genuine economic leverage over the Islamic Republic. Beijing is Tehran's largest trading partner. Chinese companies are the primary investors in Iranian oil infrastructure. If Beijing decides that the cost to its own manufacturing sector and power grid of a sustained Hormuz closure exceeds the cost of pressuring Tehran into a ceasefire, China becomes the most important diplomatic actor in this crisis. Not the United States, not Europe, not the United Nations. China. That calculation is being made right now in real time in the government buildings of Beijing as officials brief Xi Jinping on exactly what a 1-month, 2-month, 3-month Hormuz closure means for Chinese industrial output, consumer prices, and social stability. When China reaches its economic pain threshold, the diplomatic channel that matters most will not be Washington to Tehran. It will be Beijing to Tehran. And that conversation, when it happens, will happen on terms that no American policymaker fully controls. Here is what the mainstream coverage of this conflict consistently fails to explain to the American public. The Strait of Hormuz is not primarily America's problem. The United States achieved functional energy independence through the shale revolution. The immediate price shock at the American pump is cushioned by domestic production capacity that no other major consuming nation possesses. The existential energy crisis of this moment is happening in Tokyo. It is happening in Seoul. It is happening in New Delhi and Shanghai and in every industrial city in Asia that wakes up every morning needing oil that is currently anchored 200 miles from where it needs to be. This asymmetry, that America can absorb the pain more easily than its largest trading partners in Asia, creates a strategic dynamic that will shape every negotiation going forward. The longer the Hormuz closure continues, the more desperate China, Japan, South Korea, and India become for a resolution. Their desperation is Washington's leverage. Their energy vulnerability is America's negotiating chip. What we know with certainty today is this: a secret meeting in Washington, one that was never supposed to be public, one where a Saudi prince told American officials in the most direct and unambiguous terms that inaction was the real danger, set in motion a chain of events that has closed the most important 21 miles of water on Earth, killed a supreme leader who had ruled for 35 years, triggered the largest Iranian missile and drone campaign in the Islamic Republic's history, struck 9 countries simultaneously, pushed oil prices toward levels that threaten the global recovery, severed the insurance underpinnings of global commerce, and created a leadership vacuum in Tehran that no one, not Washington, not Riyadh, not Beijing, not Moscow, not the Iranian people themselves, knows how to fill safely. The men in that room thought they were managing a crisis. They thought they were preventing something worse. History will judge whether they were right. But what is beyond dispute is that the world that existed on February 27, 2026, a world where a diplomatic agreement seemed within reach, where oil flowed through Hormuz, where a supreme leader still ruled in Tehran, and where the Middle East was navigating its tensions through back channels and careful diplomacy, that world is gone. And the world that has replaced it is more dangerous, more expensive, more uncertain, and more consequential for every American, every investor, every saver, and every family that fills a gas tank, pays a utility bill, buys groceries, or holds a retirement account than anything we have seen since the Arab oil embargo of 1973. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the dimension that will determine whether the human cost of this conflict was worth what it might ultimately achieve. The stated objective of regime change in Iran, of bringing a new, more cooperative government to power in Tehran, is not simply a military question. It is a nation-building question of the most daunting order. Iran is not a small country with a compliant population and no history of resistance. It is a civilization of 90 million people with a 4,000-year history of statehood, a proud national identity that transcends the current regime, and a population that has shown, in waves of protest and resilience, that it is capable of both opposing its government and rallying around it when faced with foreign attack. The Iranian population that marched in the streets during the protests of 2022 and 2023, demanding an end to theocratic rule, did not do so because they wanted American bombs. They did so because they wanted their own freedom, on their own terms, through their own political process. American military action in their country does not automatically become their liberation. It may become their humiliation. And a humiliated Iranian public, whatever it thinks of the Islamic Republic, has historically united behind resistance to foreign intervention with a ferocity that no outside power has ever been able to extinguish. This is the lesson of 1953, when an American-backed coup overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh and planted the seeds of the resentment that eventually produced the 1979 revolution. It is the lesson that strategic planners in Washington either do not know or have chosen to ignore. The road from military victory over an Iranian government to a stable, cooperative Iran that serves American and Israeli and Saudi interests is not a road that anyone in that secret meeting has a map for. And without a map, the most powerful military in human history can win every battle and still lose the war. If you are watching this and you want to understand not just the geopolitics, but the financial implications for your savings, your investments, and your energy costs in the months ahead, hit that subscribe button right now. We are tracking every development in this conflict as it unfolds, from the oil markets to the gold markets to the succession crisis in Tehran to the secret diplomatic channels that are being opened even as the missiles are still being counted. The world is at an inflection point. The decisions being made in the next 30 days will shape the global economy for the next 30 years. You need to be informed. You need to understand what is really happening behind the headlines, and that is exactly what this channel is here for. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is really happening in the world right now, because the story you just heard is not the end. It is only the beginning. Consider what the next 30 days might bring. The succession in Tehran will either consolidate around Mojtaba Khamenei and the IRGC, producing a leadership that has every political incentive to escalate, or it will fracture into a power struggle between factions, reformists, pragmatists, hardliners, and military commanders, each trying to claim the mantle of resistance while privately calculating what peace might cost them and what war might cost the people who have to live through it. The Strait of Hormuz will either reopen through American naval operations or through diplomatic channels that run through Beijing, Ankara, or New Delhi. Oil will either stay above $90 per barrel and begin translating into consumer pain that changes political calculations in Washington, or it will find a fragile floor while the world waits to see what happens next. Gold will either continue its role as the world's ultimate insurance policy in a moment of profound systemic uncertainty, or peace will come faster than markets expect, and prices will retrace. These are the variables that every investor, every saver, every retirement planner, and every American trying to navigate the next chapter of their financial life needs to be watching in real time. Not because the situation is hopeless. It is not hopeless. Crises end. Wars end. Diplomacy reasserts itself. The question is always the cost at which it does. And right now, that cost is being negotiated in secret, in rooms where the cameras cannot reach, by men who are not elected and not accountable, making decisions that will reverberate for a generation. The least we can do is understand what is happening. That is what this channel exists to do. And that is why, now more than ever, you need to stay informed.